Mark Rogers TV joining you for some college football talk each and every Thursday night with Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com. So there's a number of things that you need to know. One is that you catch Joe on GoForThe2.com. He's got the latest information on college football. You also make your way to Amazon to look up his college football preview for 2017. So Joe Lisi, Go for the Two. Just keep that in your mind. You're always going for the two. Go for the jugular. Be Oregon. Go for the two. Make it 8-0 right out of the gate. Go for the two. And then also understand that going forward, we started this last week. We're going to make this available for you. Joe and I talking college football like nobody else does. Each and every Thursday night, you can catch the feed. Just go directly to MarkRogersTV.com or catch my Twitter feed, and I will send out the link there as well. Joe, how you doing tonight?
Oh, chomping at the bit, Mark. We're still about 3 months away from the start of the college football season. The previews started to hit the newsstands. Mine was out on May 1st, so I can't wait. I'm really breaking down the season and love talking college football with you.
So we're going to make our way to what most people still believe to be the best conference in college football, although for much of the regular season, the Big Ten looked to be extremely strong. And then once postseason came, the ACC really stepped it up. But the SEC, top to bottom, if you look at the recruiting rankings, if you look at the NFL draft, still has exceptional talent. Alabama, of course, with another SEC championship and winning again. Auburn being the last team other than Bama to win the SEC in 2013. Despite the freshman quarterback and despite a few hiccups along the way, Alabama survived. They made it to the championship game, and they played their best football down the stretch, dominated Auburn, dominated Washington until they ran into Deshaun Watson. So, Joe, your thoughts about the Tide heading into 2017?
Well, obviously, I think there's a lot of moving parts for the 2017 Alabama Crimson Tide, Mark. You look at the 6 losses on defense. They lose 36.5 of the team's FBS, leading 54 sacks from last year. Gone is Jonathan Allen. Gone is Reuben Foster, Tim Williams, Ryan Anderson, Tomlinson from that defensive front seven that I really think is going to take a big hit from production-wise, especially at the early part of the year. Now, I know Nick Saban gets top 5 recruits year in and year out, but you're talking about a loss of a lot of playmakers on the defensive side of the ball, coupled with the fact of Eddie Jackson and Marlon Humphrey moving on to the NFL. You look at the offensive side of the ball, they lose Cam Robinson, they lose Ardarius Stewart, and they lose tight end O.J. Howard, and they have a new offensive coordinator in Brian Dable. I think that's where the biggest concern is in terms of you look at the inconsistency possibly for Alabama. I've said it before, when you have a new offensive coordinator, especially an offensive coordinator, you're seeing the game through a different set of eyes. Even though you still might have the same talent and same offensive scheme, he's got to understand how that talent responds in game situations, and then he has to call a game plan around that. It's not an easy fix, and they're like pitchers and quarterbacks. They need to get into a rhythm, and secondly, he might be less aggressive play caller than Lane Kiffin was on certain downs, first and second down especially, and that could be where the Achilles heel is for the Alabama Crimson Tide. That being said, on paper, I still have them at 9-3 overall, winning the SEC West and getting to the SEC championship game.
Hey, Joe, I like the direction you're going with the Lane Kiffin take, because Lane Kiffin is an exceptional play caller, but I think he needs to have the quarterback in place. He loves the mismatches on the outside. He loves to create mismatches and do some exotic things with the offense, but he needs the right guy in play. Jalen Hurts more the athlete than the signal caller, precision passer that Lane Kiffin likes. This may be a more comfortable situation with this quarterback for Nick Saban, just having a grinded out conventional offense where he can let Jalen Hurts make one read, throw the ball, or take off and run with it. And that might be a better fit, because Lane Kiffin, at the end of his stay at Alabama, certainly had his squabbles with Nick Saban, and then Steve Sarkisian obviously didn't make the cut after the performance against Washington. Jalen Hurts is going to have to be more precision with the football downfield. Calvin Ridley, of course, back in the fold, but they lose Ardarius Stewart on the outside. And you mentioned O.J. Howard. Despite the lack of use in the offense much of the time, he was still the most talented tight end in college football, and that showed up with his selection in the first round of the NFL draft. Ronnie Harrison's an exceptional safety. Anthony Averett at corner. Minkah Fitzpatrick, they're still trying to determine whether they're going to play him at corner, where he had 6 picks and 2 INT pick sixes. or possibly move him to safety. We're hearing a number of things out of Alabama camp in terms of what they want to do with Minka Fitzpatrick, but they're going to have to figure it all out and get it straight very quickly because Florida State's game number 1, and that should be a heck of a football game. LSU has been the primary threat to Alabama in years gone by, but in recent years, the Tide's been the better team, but still a 0-0 game with about 10 minutes left to play in Baton Rouge last year. Darius Geis filled in capably for Leonard Fournette. LSU, would they be, in your mind, the biggest threat to the Tide?
I think they are. I have them right behind Alabama at 9-3 overall, and it's going to come down to that game, in my opinion, in Tuscaloosa. But it does come down to the health of Danny Etling, their quarterback. He did have off-season shoulder surgery, even though it was arthroscopic. How's his health going to be heading into fall camp? That's a major concern that I have. Secondly is Matt Canada, the new offensive coordinator from Pittsburgh, did wonders with quarterback Nate Peterman. I think it's his aggressive play calling, especially on first and second down, because teams over the last couple of years, even with Ed Orgeron in those ball games that they lost, they stacked the box against Danny Etling and forced him to throw over the top. They lose Traven Durrell, they lose Malachi Dupree. How aggressive will Matt Canada be on first and second down to loosen up opposing defensive front sevens to force to actually open up running lanes in later in the ball game will really be, in my opinion, whether LSU takes the next step in challenging Alabama. You look at the defensive losses. They lose Adams. They lose Tre'Davious White, their lockdown corner. Those are going to be huge, especially against their week 1 matchup against Tanner Magnum and BYU. Tanner Magnum's a prototypical quarterback that's going to attack that LSU Tigers secondary vertically. So keep an eye out for that in week number 1. But here's the key for LSU's defense. They held 5 opponents last year to under 100 yards rushing. They were 5-0 in those ball games and won those games by 24 points per game. As long as the defensive front seven under Dave Aranda progresses, I think this team could challenge Alabama, and it does come down to Arden Key as well. He left the team in the spring. How will he be at the start of fall camp? Keep an eye out for that, but it does hinge on Danny Etling's success in the passing game.
I thought Jamal Adams was possibly the best safety in America, selected number 6 in the NFL draft by the New York Jets, a guy that could really turn the hips and cover just your tight end, your wide receiver, your slot guy, but also laid the lumber and came downhill on the run and played extremely well. Yeah, you mentioned the losses in the defensive secondary for the LSU Tigers. They had them along the defensive front with Davin Godchow in particular. He's gone, and Tayshawn Bauer gone. Duke Riley and Kendall Beckwith, 2 extremely productive linebackers, gone from LSU. Dante Jackson, probably the most talented corner that they've got coming back, and one of the fastest players in the SEC. Danny Etling, a lot of people aren't real excited about Danny Etling at quarterback. He's a pro-style guy that's not going to make a lot of wow-type plays. I talked to an LSU insider last night who's fine with Danny Etling, thinks that the Tigers have enough compliments elsewhere, and with Darius Geis going off most likely for 1,500 yards this season, think Danny Etling's actually the best complemented quarterback in an offense with you mentioned the track record at NC State, Wisconsin, and most notably there at Pitt, and reviving a Pitt offense that's been very pedestrian in recent years, and they were just exploded. And to think how good Clemson was on defense late in the season, and Pitt went off under Matt Canada for 43 points in that game. LSU this is maybe what they need to utilize all that talent and get it under a guy that can really put it together scheme-wise to threaten some defenses. Auburn, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Arkansas, out of that mix, who do you like? It's interesting that Ole Miss was really, really strong just a couple of years ago, and now suddenly it appears though Hugh Freeze might be on the hot seat.
Yeah, he's on the hot seat, but I think Gus Malzahn is as well, and even Brett Bielema out of that group that you mentioned. Here's the thing. I think out of the group that you mentioned, the best bet, in my opinion, to really challenge those two is Arkansas. As crazy as that might seem, you're talking about a team that does have Austin Allen at the quarterback position. I know Raleigh Williams has decided to retire from football, the team's leading rusher with over 1,300 rushing yards last year. But you're talking about an offensive line in 2016 that really started the year with 3 of 5 new offensive line starters. This was a team that averaged around 189 rushing yards per game in 2015. They dipped down to 164 rushing yards on the ground. That put a lot of pressure on Austin Allen, but a lot of it was due to the lack of cohesiveness of the offensive line. If you look at Arkansas throughout the year last year, when they were able to run the football over 200 yards per game, they dominated those matchups. They were 5-0 overall when they rushed for over 200 yards. 4 came against FBS opponents, and they won those games by more than 20 points per game. So as long as Arkansas can run the football consistently, I think they'll be right there. Even though Raleigh Williams has decided to move on, I still like Austin Allen, and I like the offensive line. Defensively, I think they can hold some teams in place. I pick in Arkansas to go 9-3 overall out of that group.
Dan Mullen made a comment after the bowl game, St. Petersburg Bowl, if I recall correctly, where they narrowly beat. They needed a blocked field goal to hold off a MAC team in Miami by 1 point. But he was excited about Nick Fitzgerald, but knew that Fitzgerald needed to eliminate some mistakes and become more of a consistent quarterback here in 2017, but was excited about what he had seen out of his quarterback this season. They do lose Fred Ross on the outside, a wide receiver. They do have some playmakers coming back at Mississippi State, and it's always a struggle for them in that division. And when you mentioned coaches on the hot seat, and we looked at the rest of the division past Saban and Orgeron, you could also throw Kevin Sumlin into the mix. 8-5, 8-5, 8-5, 8-5, and with the recruiting classes they have and the money that they've pumped into that facility, you would think maybe the shine is worn off of Kevin Sumlin, and he needs to win big, get to a big bowl game, do something special there with the Aggies.
Yeah, I mean, last year they were my surprise team. I really thought that Trevor Knight's mobility would be the difference with the wide receivers that they had coming over. Obviously, Josh Reynolds, Ricky Seals-Jones. They had Christian Kirk. They had Speedy Noyle that really could stretch teams vertically. And the mobility of Trevor Knight, in my opinion, was the difference for that offense. They started 6-0. It looked like they would challenge Alabama. They had that lead 14-13 and lost that ball game by 19 points. It was unfortunate because I really thought they were in that ball game from start to finish. And then at the end of the year, not only did Trevor Knight get hurt, but that defensive front seven did wear down against bigger physical offensive lines. Even with Deshaun Hall and Myles Garrett, Texas A&M allowed 191 rushing yards on the ground to opposing offenses. That's going to be the cause of concern for this team heading into 2017. They lose Evans, their big play safety from that group. And offensively now, Jake Hubenak, Mond is in the quarterback battle. I mean, again, I think it's a big drop-off from Trevor Knight. Again, did he put up dynamic numbers last year in College Station in the passing game? No, but he made solid decisions and not being able to turn the ball over. And his ability took the pressure off the offensive line that really struggled in 2015 in terms of sacks allowed. That's where I have concerns for this offense. I think they're going to have to run the football more consistently with Keith Ford and Travion Williams. I have them right at 6-6 overall. I think Texas A&M, from a speed perspective, lost a lot with those wide receivers, and defensively, they're not as physical as they were last year with the 2 defensive end losses, and that's where I have concerns for Kevin Sumlin's group in 2017.
I would agree on the defensive side of the ball. They do have Armani Watts coming back at safety, who's one of the best at that position in the country, but the loss of Hall and Garrett's going to have to be made up for elsewhere. Arkansas, a bit of a sleeper, but they've got some pieces. And Austin Allen, I think, is an underrated quarterback. We move to the Eastern Division, owned by Florida for the last 2 years, but Gator fans not extremely happy with the output of the offense, and especially at the quarterback position, and considering that they really haven't been able to compete with the elite teams, losing 4 consecutive games to Florida State, being manhandled by the Crimson Tide in the SEC championship game. Tennessee It appeared as though last year needed to be their window of opportunity, as they had brought in those recruiting classes one after one after one, and then they had matured those teams from under 500 to 7-6 to 9-4 to 9-4, and they seem to have grown up together. And that was their year to capitalize with Josh Dobbs at quarterback, and they won the key game against Florida, the one that everyone pointed to, and then they're dropping games to South Carolina and Vanderbilt. And then, of course, you've got Georgia in the mix, lackluster 8-5, but I think the momentum's headed their way with Kirby Smart bringing in a great recruiting class, and Jacob Eason expected to be much better as a sophomore. So they're the three prime contenders.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Mark. Great insight for you. I think I'll go down the row. I mean, I have Georgia as the best team in this conference. Couple of factors why. It does come down to the quarterback position. Yeah, Jacob Eason struggled for much of the year last year in the early part of the season, but I feel like Kirby Smart made the right decision in starting him in 2016. Let's be honest. The reason why Georgia got rid of Mark Richt is that he couldn't take them over the hump. So if Kirby Smart were to start Grayson Lambert last year and the team limped to another 9-3 or 10-3 year, that's exactly what Mark Richt did previously in his tenure. It was imperative that he started Jacob Eason last year, sort of, I want to say, of a rebuilding year, not a lot of expectations with a first-year coach. He got the game experience. He got better as the year progressed. He threw 8 touchdowns, 3 interceptions in the last 8 games of the year. He weeded out the guys that fit his type of style offensively and defensively. And if you look at the way the defense played last year, 23 of the 29 sacks under Kirby Smart came in the last 8 games of the year. To me, that shows that he understood his progression and understood how he was understood his scheme in the program. And for me, that's why I like Georgia this year. I think that when you look at Georgia, they have Nick Chubb, they have Sony Michel. I think Terry Godwin's a guy that's really going to break out in 2017. And I think this team from an offense and defensive lines really is the most complete team in the country. You look at Florida, I mean, it all hinges on a couple of factors. You got Trask, you got Felipe Franks battling it out. Where's the health of Luke Del Rio going to be after his second surgery on that shoulder? And defensively, they take some major losses. They lose Tease Tabor. They lose Quincy Wilson. They lose Caleb Brantley. They lose Morrison on that defense and Davis. I mean, those are huge losses for that defensive front seven. I think Jim McElwain's done a fantastic job, but they're going to have to run the football more consistently. They only averaged 128 yards per game last year compared to his first year there in Gainesville. They were up in the area of about 186 yards per game, and that's why they struggle from a defensive perspective. Lack of inconsistency put a lot of pressure on Austin Appleby. When you look at Tennessee, let's be honest now. I mean, Butch Jones, the pressure was on them to win the SEC East last year. He had 17 total starters coming back. This was a team that really struggled in run support with Derek Barnett and Jalen Reeves-Maben. They allowed 212 rushing yards on the ground. They allowed over 400 yards rushing to Missouri, over 400 to Kentucky. You cannot do that in Knoxville and expect to win the SEC East. Even though they won those ball games, I mean, look at who they lose this year. They lose Derek Barnett. They lose Reeves-Maben on the defensive side of the ball. Shaq Wiggins is supposed to transfer there from Louisville, but now there's thoughts that he might move to another program, so we're not sure about that. They lose Alvin Kamara and Jalen Hurd and Josh Malone on the outside. And, oh, by the way, they also lose Josh Dobbs, who was a mobile quarterback, and let's be honest, didn't have a significant road win as a starting quarterback in the SEC. And you have to make up for that production in 2017 with a very difficult schedule. I have Georgia at 10-2. I have Florida at 8-4, and I have Tennessee at 6-6 in 2017.
Tennessee's also going to be without Cam Sutton, who's been a leader in that secondary for 4 consecutive years and had some injuries this past season, but basically has answered the bell for 4 seasons since his freshman campaign and also returned kicks effectively for the Vols as well. My thoughts about Florida is that I think Felipe Franks is the guy that everyone wants to win the job, and coming out of spring camp, he looked to be the guy, strongest arm, the guy that's a dynamic playmaker. Luke Del Rio couldn't compete because he was on the shelf. Defensively, Chauncey Gardner, won the Outback Bowl MVP against Iowa, had a couple picks in that game, plus a pick six, so as they try to replace Tease Tabor and, as you mentioned, Quincy Wilson there. Duke Dawson is a guy that got burned a lot at corner for Florida, and they need him to step up and take a prime position on that defense. Antonio Callaway, exceptional athlete, drops too many passes. He's going to have to be a better factor. One thing that has kind of accompanied the misery at quarterback over the last couple of years for Florida has been the offensive line. The offensive line has not been championship standard to compete with the likes of Florida State and Alabama, and they've really gotten hurt there. And they need that offensive line to continue to improve. It did some last year, but not nearly enough that they need to take on the likes of those kind of teams. One of my favorite bowl games to watch, very under the radar last year, Georgia TCU, because I was looking at Jacob Eason, and I was almost thinking at that point, Joe, it's almost been a blessing in disguise that Sony Michel and Nick Chubb got nicked up and stayed in college another year. Now we got to see in the second half of that game when they came back from 9 or 10 points down what that team could look like with Jacob Eason coming off play action when everybody's focused on Chubb and Michelle. And sure, he threw some wild passes. He's a young quarterback, but man, he showed off his strong arm. They had Chubb and Michelle both running for close to 100+ yards. And you got a glimpse of what Georgia could be. Now they got 9 starters coming back on defense. Dominic Sanders leads that secondary along with Malcolm Parrish. Yeah, I'm right there with you. You've sold me on Georgia. I think they're an extremely under the radar team to possibly make some noise on the national scene. When we look at Joe Vandy, Kentucky, and South Carolina, I said it a number of times leading into last season that the team or teams out of those 3 that can win that collection of games, like if you can beat the other 2, then that's going to be one of the keys to bowl eligibility. I guess we'll start with South Carolina. They have found a quarterback in Jake Bentley. They scored a ton of points against South Florida despite losing the Birmingham Bowl. And Brian Edwards is an emerging wide receiver along with Deebo Samuel. So they actually have some pieces in place possibly now.
Yeah, they do. They have Rico Dowdell, their big play running back as well. The one thing about South Carolina that we're looking at, I mean, in terms of the Gamecocks, Mark, they didn't beat a team with a winning record in 2016. I mean, the only team that they beat with a winning record was Tennessee. I mean, outside of that, they did not beat anyone. So that's the concern I have for South Carolina. I mean, they get Skay Moore coming back, their leading tackler from 2 years ago. That's a big boost to that defense. But this is a defense that still allowed over 200 rushing yards per game last year. From an offensive perspective, I think they have some pieces in place. I love Jake Bentley's progression. I think he's a dynamic quarterback. That's why Brandon McElwain decided to move on to California and transfer out of that program. So, again, offensively are not where my concerns are for this team. It's on the defensive front 7. Will Muschamp wasn't able to turn around Auburn's defense in his 1 year as defensive coordinator. I don't think from a recruiting aspect on the front 7, South Carolina is viable to really make strides off of 6 and 7 last year. I think they overachieved. I have them at 4 and 8. It's coupled with, a lack of talent on the defensive side of the ball. And did you take a look at their schedule for 2017? A very difficult schedule for the Gamecocks overall.
I think quarterback play might be a little bit better in this conference. Going back to Manziel and McCarron and Murray and those guys, that was the last strong quarterback play we had, and it's really slumped since then, despite Chad Kelly and a few guys that have popped up. Drew Locke coming back for his next season. We talked about the advancement of Bentley and Eason, despite Tennessee losing Dobbs. Austin Allen, Jalen Hurts, more experienced young quarterbacks in this conference. And we'll finish up with your thoughts on Drew Locke in Missouri, Kentucky as they move on, and also who have we missed here? I guess that's about it with Vandy and Kentucky.
I'll throw it all out there, everybody we missed. I'll touch on everyone. I mean, for Vanderbilt, Kyle Shermer is a guy that's going to really have to progress. He had 9 touchdown passes in 2016. Ralph Webb in that rushing attack. They're going to want to run the football. In order for Vanderbilt to build off of last year's 6-7 record, they're going to need to stretch teams vertically because of their inability to play from behind. That's where they struggle. They lose their big play linebacker, Zach Cunningham, from that team, 125 touchdown tackles. That's going to be a major loss. Again, I think this team, from a schedule perspective, 6-6 in 2017. It all hinges on Kyle Shermer, his ability to make progressions. They have a solid wide receiver core that can really aid that, but it's up to Kyle Shermer to take the next step in his reads and progressions. I have Vanderbilt at 6-6 overall, but they're a team that, if they get into their style, low-scoring, ball control type of attack, they can play with some teams in the conference, not just the East, but in the West. They challenged Auburn last year. You look at Kentucky, like Derek, their quarterback Johnson, that took over for Drew Barker last year, midway through the year, 13 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, a little bit of an inconsistent quarterback from a completion percentage, but they're going to have to stop teams in terms of run support. The last couple of years for Kentucky, they could not stop teams in terms of big physical offensive lines, and they struggled in their bowl loss to Georgia Tech, another running offense. They allowed 196 rushing yards per game in 2015. They allowed way over 200 yards last year in 2016. I have them right there at 6-6 overall. I think they're going to need to really step up from a physicality perspective on the defensive side of the ball in order to build off of last year's success. You look at Auburn. Auburn I have at 7-5 overall. We spoke about it last time. They only have 2 games, one game over the last 2 years in which they passed for over 300 yards. Came in 2015 in the loss to Ole Miss. They passed for 308 in that loss 2 years ago. But again, they averaged 271 rushing yards per game last year. Now they're going to Jarrett Stidham. Should he beat out Sean White? They want to go back to this experiment of stretching teams vertically. They did it 2 years ago with Jeremy Johnson. Did not work out. I have concerns about Auburn. I have them at 7-5 overall. They lose Montravius Adams and Carl Lawson that led that team with 13.5 sacks. That's a cause of concern. I look at Mississippi State at 5-7 overall, Mark. Nick Fitzgerald is the offense. He's 66% of the rushing touchdown production for 2016. He's 49% of the rushing production for that team. I think they're going to struggle from a schedule perspective, a very difficult schedule. Their secondary allowed 281 passing yards per game. I think they beat Ole Miss in the Egg Bowl, but I still have them at 5-7 overall. We touched on Shea Patterson. Love his upside, love his ability. You look at the defensive side of the ball, that's where I have concerns. Even though Marquise Haynes comes back, they allowed 7 of 8 SEC opponents to rush for over 200 yards on the ground last year. You cannot win games in the SEC West unless you're able to shut down physical offensive lines and run support. That's not Ole Miss's strength. They lose Evan Ingram. They lose some core wide receivers there. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the offensive line and Shea Patterson to step up. I think they're dead last in the SEC West.
One big addition, though, for the Rebels is they get back Darius Webster, who was lost against Florida State, one of the worst injuries you're going to see. First quarter play downfield, broke the leg. He's back, though, and Ken Webster, one of the best cover corners in the SEC, and he'll be back after a big 2015 and missing basically all of 2016. I'm only going to focus on one team here, Joe, and it's because I'm rooting for Vandy. Got to root for Vandy. Kyle Shermer coming down the stretch really poured it on. They somehow found an offense. Who would have thought that a team that was 4-6 had lost to Mizzou and Kentucky, was facing Ole Miss and Tennessee the last 2 games, would win those 2 games. We know that the Rebels and the Vols were hobbling at that point, but still Vandy wins 2 big ball games. You mentioned the effort that they had on the Plains at Auburn, where they almost pulled out that game. Kyle Shermer somehow suddenly they had a sub 100 rated offense in the country, and then the last 2 games they caught fire, and Shermer blitzed those 2 opponents for over 400 yards per game in the last 2 games. The offense brings back 9 starters. You mentioned the receivers coming back. The secondary is one of the most underrated units, and this, for some strange reason, seems to have been a stapled strength going back to James Franklin days. The secondary has always been good at Vandy, and again will be again this season. Zach Cunningham, yes, gone, but they bring back the kicker in the punter, who were two of the best in the SEC as well. And I hope Vandy's able to keep up there, because it seemed as though Franklin had the two big seasons at 9-4, 9-4, and Derek Mason just seemed over his head, inheriting a decent core and a decent program, and suddenly out of the gate he gets blasted by Temple, and he can't do anything right, and he just seemed overmatched. But it seems as though he's gained his sea legs, and maybe he has something working there.
Yeah, I love the foundation that they have. They have rocking uniforms too. Those all black home games in Nashville. I mean, doesn't get better than that. Again, I think you saw the progression of the offense. Again, they were more aggressive down the stretch, because let's be honest, they needed to win ball games. Their backs were against the wall, like you mentioned, and they really had to win those last two ball games to become bowl eligible. If they could take that approach at the beginning of the year and be more aggressive, as opposed to forcing teams into a methodical, low-scoring type of game where they run the football consistently, they can score points early, which would really aid their defense. So, again, I think it's not so much how many times a game you pass. It's just when you call passing plays. If you're more aggressive on first and second down, you can loosen up opposing defenses, which would then open up the running game later in contests. So I agree with you. Vandy has the potential to pass, especially if Kyle Sherman progresses, becomes a more confident quarterback, becomes a guy that understands where he wants to go with the football. They can possibly be an 8 or 9 win team, because they have the physicality on the defensive side of the ball to play with some of the big boys. The other team we didn't talk about, and I just want to mention it, is Missouri with their quarterback, Drew Locke. That's my surprise team for 2017. I have them right at 7-5. It does come down to Drew Locke. Drew Locke, he only completed 49% of his passes in 2015. They only averaged 13 points per game, but he exploded last year. They averaged 31 points per game. They have a big play running back in Demaria Crockett. That was a 1,000-yard rusher. It's going to hinge again on the defense. They lose Charles Harris, and because of their up-tempo attack, Mark, their defense allowed 232 rushing yards per game, almost 100 yards more than they allowed in 2015. I think they could be more conditioned this year in terms of their defensive front seven, in terms of going back out there and understanding the tempo of the offense. I think they're going to surprise some people. I think Drew Locke will be a confident quarterback. You saw what he was able to do in the season-ending victory over Arkansas. They almost pushed Tennessee to the limit. Don't let that game deceive you. They put up over 700 total yards on the Tennessee defense in Knoxville. That was a 7-point ball game late in the fourth quarter before their defense gave way. Keep an eye out for Missouri in 2017.
And one of the reasons Drew Locke could have a breakout 2017 is the emergence of Jamon Moore, who caught 62 passes, over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns last year, actually led the SEC in plus 10-yard pass receptions with 31 and 8 40-yard pass receptions, and he's going to be the go-to guy again this fall. The Mizzou Tigers have some winnable games out of the gate, and they're quote-unquote big non-conference games against Purdue. I was checking out Vandy's schedule as well. They come out with the 2 winnable FCS games. Then they've got an interesting date against Kansas State. They'll be an underdog, but it's a winnable game against like talent against the Wildcats, and that would be a huge win, of course, for Vandy after they dropped the big non-conference game against Georgia Tech and were blasted against the Yellow Jackets this past season, and lost, of course, again, the bowl game to NC State, and were completely outclassed in that one as well. You need to know that Joe Lisi and I are getting together each and every Thursday night to talk college football wire to wire every Thursday night. You can join us here at Mark Rogers TV right around 9 o'clock. I'll send out the link on my Twitter feed, and you can catch it right there as well. It's Go for the Two, goforthe2.com. You can catch Joe's latest college football information there. You check out his book on Amazon. Order it. 657 Power Pack pages of college football preview for 2017. Joe, it's always a great discussion, man.
Love the show, Mark. Anytime.